Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before we went outside because of the fire alarm, we were just finishing up with the short landing ATR 42. You would need 2 planes, 3 planes max, instead of 5 or 6 planes that is now needed. Mr. Speaker, in my wind-up, I want to finish with Cayman Airways and what it does for the country and all the importance of its offering. We know what it did as far as an insurance policy to get us through COVID. We know what it's done as an insurance policy to get us through hurricanes and bad weather. To make it as simple and as easy as possible to understand the value of CAL. If you look at how the budget reflects core, strategic, domestic, the average stayover guest stays 6 days. They spend around $1,800 for that week. If you put 100 stayover guests on a Cal 737-8 in JFK, and you fly them down, and you charge them $500 round trip, but it costs you more than $500 round trip to bring them here. Let's say it costs you $800. So the government purchases that $300 from CAL because the government is going to have the difference between what they spend and what it costs to get them here spent in the local economy that becomes our second driver for our economy. We encourage that. It's a model that has worked for many years, and we have excellent planes, good service, good pilots, good staffing. So all is good with that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now that we have aired out and got commitment from the minister about the ATRs and sorting out Cayman Brac and Little Cayman, I want to finish up by just reviewing, because there's a cost for everything. And I appreciate that there will be a question, and the ministry, the management of CAL will have to justify how they look at these routes. So in the budget, we have domestic air services, $3,134,000. We have tourism, regional, and core, $15,435,000. We have capital investment, $12,100,000. We have an operating deficit of $13,100,000. Mr. Speaker, I find it hard to believe that with what has to take place, you have to basically sell 2 planes. I would say you'll net $3 or $4 million. The Twin Otters are very valuable planes. You'll probably get $6, $7 million. So you got $10 million that will cover a short-term solution. But this is not short-term when you're looking at the type of investment the government is going to make and continues to make, and what private sector is going to make. So I raise these points to say that if more funding is needed, I believe on balance, this is people-centric to give the proper service to Cayman Brac and Little Cayman to develop the islands into sustainability, to give health care to the Caymanian people, to get transportation for all of their daily needs, and it's extremely important to push this forward. So I laid out the numbers. 2 years, it's a $70 million spend. You get, from that, we made the comment that if we don't have proper air service, nothing can happen as far as development. What I would like to see with that, or if there is more that is needed once it's looked at, that the Cayman Airways employees get increases. You talked about the new legislation which has been in place for 3 or 4 years, but also industry standard is what Cayman Airways works by, industry standard. So to review and make sure that our employees are industry standard or better. Better domestic service as soon as possible to Cayman Brac and Little Cayman. And to fly the routes that benefit the Cayman Islands tourism product and the people of the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for giving me the opportunity and the time to offer my comments this morning on the budget. I thank my colleagues for listening and committing and being involved in an important way forward for tourism, important way forward for Cayman Brac and Little Cayman. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my family. I want to thank my PA, Miss Liz Walton-Thompson. I want to thank my committee and my constituents in Cayman Brac West and Little Cayman, and all of Cayman Brac. I want to take this opportunity to give thanks to God for our many blessings and wish everyone safe and happy Christmas season.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for Cayman Brac West and Little Cayman. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Got it on mute. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I did promise to try and be brief. I'm already short. Mr. Speaker, let me start by congratulating the Governor on a most thoughtful and gracious message from the throne. Mr. Speaker, the Governor, and her key points were so very timely as we debate and dissect this 2024-2025 budget. Her Excellency spoke of the external factors that have created challenges for our people, Mr. Speaker, such as the wars between Russia and the Ukraine, and Israel and Hamas, and the ongoing tensions across Asia. Mr. Speaker, these external threats have caused what Her Excellency termed as steep cost of living increases. We've seen significant increases in foods and raw materials such as steel and fuel and other oil-based products, Mr. Speaker. And I fear we have not seen the end of these challenges. Mr. Speaker, COVID and the aforementioned wars, coupled with a global recession, has brought tremendous pressure to the cost of living for our people and threatens the very ability to live comfortably. Mr. Speaker, Her Excellency listed her 4 areas of priorities, those being firstly, education, second, health, third, infrastructure, and fourth, the environment. These are all very broad and important subjects, however, Mr. Speaker. I am more concerned about the things that are affecting our people on a daily basis, such as traffic, housing, cost of living, and the mental health struggles that these pressures are causing on our people. Mr. Speaker, I was heartened to hear the Honorable Premier, my friend, as she so aptly articulated on the UPM's plans to address these and many other issues facing our people. I could hear, Mr. Speaker, the passion in the Honorable Premier's voice and her commitment and stamina in delivering the government's plans through the budget address, laying the foundation for our people's well-being, and the budget policy statement, nurturing a future, a united, sustainable path to recovery, hope, and prosperity. I know it could not have been easy, Mr. Speaker, to put this budget together in such a short period of time. All of the indications that we received was that the budget needed to be scrapped and a temporary budget put in place. So we understand the commitment that was made to deliver this budget. But Mr. Speaker, I hope we are not once again falling into what I termed as a packed trap of overpromising and underdelivering. In his contribution to the budget debate, the leader of the opposition spoke about the record levels of spending by the PAC government and the way in which their budget 2 years ago included excessive levels of borrowing in order to fund their capital spending plans. Mr. Speaker, the leader also spoke about the $1.2 billion price tag attached to future infrastructure projects that the PAC has committed to and the need to lay out clearly how those projects can be funded and the prudential rules adhered to. These are important issues, Mr. Speaker, but it may be that they are issues that we do not need to worry about. We only have to worry about funding projects if there's any hope of them actually getting delivered. Mr. Speaker, let me take the time to examine the previous government, the PAC government's track record of failure, Mr. Speaker. Looking at the projects they promised 2 years ago that would be delivered. Mr. Speaker, using the latest information from the third quarter of this year, road surface upgrades, $3 million budgeted for 2023, but the spend rate in the first 9 months of the year only going at around 2/3 that would be necessary to deliver the promised programs of improvements. Minor district works should total $0.5 million in 2023, but as of 30th September, only $125,000 spent. The project to deliver a modernized court building had some $3.2 million budgeted for 2023, but only $0.5 million spent in the first 9 months. $1 million budgeted for upgrades to national parks, spending at less than half of that total as of 30th September. John Gray High School Project C, dealing with the further education center and the school sports fields, were due to be finished this year, with $5.8 million budgeted for 2023. But I note the completion date has now been put back to April of 2025. The ministry broke ground at the Theologian McCoy Primary for a new school hall in December of 2022. But at the end of September, only $1.4 million had been spent this year, and the project is not expected to be completed until at least October. The project for a hall at the Joanna Clark Primary, budgeted to cost at least $9 million, is way behind schedule. It appears not to have even started, although $3 million was expected to be spent in 2023 and will now be completed until March 2025 at the earliest. Mr. Speaker, at the Red Bay Primary, additional classroom spaces have been promised for 2 years as a part of the commitment to extend the reception classes to all schools. A contract was finally signed with 3 new classrooms only at the end of August. That is good news. The Lighthouse School expansion project seems to have stalled, Mr. Speaker. The so-called waterfront tourism experience seems only to have ever expanded in scope without any building happening on the ground. The estimated cost of the project, as set out in the government's unaudited accounts, more than tripled to over $5 million just between June and September of this year. Announced as a major priority 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the government's own estimates put the project at only 2% complete as of the 30th of September this year. The latest estimate I saw, Mr. Speaker, suggests that the construction would begin just as the minister is about to leave office. Scranton Park, a project very close to your heart, Mr. Speaker. Although it was the Progressives-led government that had acquired the land for the project in late 2018. After posed for a photo opportunity at a community cleanup in February 2019, the member for Georgetown Central told how the dream of a new park was starting to come true. He recognized that delivering the park would take resources, but criticized the then government for not immediately having the resources in place and stridently told the community, "We don't want to wait." Well, after 2.5 years of having the members at the cabinet table, after 2.5 years of having that member, Mr. Speaker, at the cabinet table, and with resources identified in the budget, the community continues to wait. Mr. Speaker, the park project remains beset by delays, and the latest official government estimate having slipped the project by yet another year. It is now expected to be complete, not to be complete until sometime in 2026. There is a beautiful artist impression on YouTube that you can look at though, Mr. Speaker. A new fit-for-purpose prison remains a very distant prospect, with the PAC having done nothing to move the project forward, despite commissioning architects over a year ago. It will be interesting to hear how the government plans to address the estimated cost of $125 million for the prison across the future years. Mr. Speaker, the promised new accommodation facility to house migrants, expected to cost $4.5 million, is delayed, whilst we have migrants wandering our neighborhoods seemingly unchecked. A new public transport system, we know, might cost $50 million, but the government has so far not even gotten as far as identifying its preferred solution, while congestion continues to blight every commuter getting to work and every parent trying to get their kids to school. And may I dare say that my good friend, the member from Bordentown East, still can't get his extra hour's sleep. A third undersea cable, Mr. Speaker, some $15 million originally budgeted for the project in 2023, but PACT has only gotten as far as commissioning a feasibility study and appointing consultants to support future work. Mr. Speaker, the promises PACT made to establish a public-private partnership to implement a national sewage and wastewater system and to establish a public-private partnership to install an underground utility network inclusive of fiber, have not made any significant progress and were never properly budgeted for in any case. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, the promise to increase and improve infrastructure in the eastern districts was never even set out in any detail, let alone delivered. And finally, the government's biggest single sustainability project, Regen, is now more than 2 years behind schedule and and the capital cost of around $200 million negotiated by the progressives has spiraled to heights we do not yet even know, thanks to the former premier's dithering and delays. I will say more about that shortly, Mr. Speaker. While they have failed to deliver the projects I've spoken about, the government continued spending excessively on other things. In some cases, Mr. Speaker, it is far from clear as to what purpose the money had been used for. Was it, as it should be, delivering agreed government objectives, or was it individual ministers going about their own way? Mr. Speaker, even when facilities do actually get off the ground, they're plagued by delays, and the government fails to get them into operational service. The new Ponciano residential mental health facility in East End, which is costing over $20 million to build, remains unopened, despite repeated promises that the new facility would be opening imminently. And of course, Mr. Speaker, it's not just capital infrastructure projects that the PAC failed to deliver. Despite record levels of operational spending, there are scores of promises that were made by the PAC government in their first strategic policy statement that have not yet been delivered. Mr. Speaker, let me take the time to highlight a few. The reintroduction of A-levels into Cayman's public high schools, not yet delivered. Ensuring home internet access for all school students, not yet delivered. Overhauling the legislative framework for health services, not yet delivered. A shuttle service for accessing district health clinics, not yet delivered. Free health care for the elderly and children, not yet delivered, Mr. Speaker. New arrangements for improved oversight of the RCIPS, not yet delivered. Implementing an effective anti-gang strategy, not yet delivered, despite the rising crime problems and all the work done by the progressives that could have been harnessed to create a solution. Lowering overall health insurance rates by increasing Syneco's competitiveness. Insurance rates, Mr. Speaker, have increased. Enact legislation to reform the pension system. Mr. Speaker, not yet delivered. Improved recycling. Mr. Speaker, recycling has gone backwards with the glass crusher out of action, while the future of the Regen project continues to be an absolute mystery. End dependency on cheap labor, failed. Reform work permit fees, not yet delivered. Increase minimum wage and consider the implementation of a universal basic income, or UBI. Mr. Speaker, they have failed to deliver to first, and as far as I can see, done nothing on the second. Decriminalization of marijuana, not delivered, and no sign of the promised referendum. Change planning fee structures to encourage smaller and energy-efficient homes, not yet delivered. Ensure the protection of mangroves. Planning decisions continue to impact existing mangrove areas. Ensure climate change policies are included in development laws, not delivered. Review and revise the National Development Plan, not yet delivered, and by the former Premier's own admission, will not be during this term. And Mr. Speaker, I do have to pause to say that all of the issues we talk about, housing crisis, traffic, rising sea levels, coastal erosion, public spaces, all of those begin with the National Development Plan. That is the foundation of these things, and we are still working on a plan that is 26 years old. And yes, Mr. Speaker, I was a minister too that tried to do it. But I feel that we had a solution. I feel that we were so close, had it not been COVID, using the Plan Cayman framework and dividing the country into 5 zones, doing 1 zone a year, therefore reviewing the plan every 5 years as the law requires. Mr. Speaker, I could add that neither the National Roads Plan, nor the National Infrastructure Plan, nor the National Stormwater Management Plan that were promised have been delivered either. Enact changes to existing labor laws and regulations, not yet delivered, Mr. Speaker. Ensure maternity, paternity, and vacation leave policies are in line with international standards. Coming? Soon come. I won't say not yet delivered. Good to change up the speech anyhow. Enact stronger legislation to protect the disabled, elderly, and other vulnerable groups. Still haven't been delivered. Mr. Speaker, provide initiatives to address the underemployment of Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, underemployment remains a real problem. Mr. Speaker, promises to revamp the National Tourism Plan. We heard that that is coming up, an interim one and then a longer term one. But to this point, Mr. Speaker, 2 years later, not delivered. As a consequence, a promise to reimagine cruise tourism has also been dropped. But we had revelations last night on where that is going, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these are not the opposition's list of demands of any kind. I want to reiterate, perhaps for those who may have just tuned in, that these are more than 25 examples of the PACT government's failure to deliver its promises and to meet its commitments. And Mr. Speaker, I could have listed many more. Mr. Speaker, I have painfully gone through this list in the spirit of illumination and certainly not criticism as we talk about the future. Mr. Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition reminded Parliament, Project Regen is the biggest. Moving on to Project Regen, I have to say a few words on that, Mr. Speaker, as I promise to try and be brief. But as the Leader of the Opposition reminded the Parliament, Project Regen is the biggest single sustainability project currently envisaged for the government. Yet instead of being embraced and driven forward, it had been the subject to endless dithering and delays. Mr. Speaker, I have been encouraged by the assurances offered by the new Honourable Minister of Sustainability. And let me say this, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. I stand ready to assist. This is near and dear to me as it sits squarely in the middle of my constituency. And before people say Cayman Bay, look at the map. From Webb Road on North Sound to Watlers Road, known as Dog City, down to Parkway and across the Cayman Bay and Britannia communities are being affected depending on the direction of the wind. Or, Mr. Speaker, God forbid we have another major fire that threatens not only these residential neighborhoods I just spoke about, but also closes a major highway bringing traffic from the north to a halt. They would lose 2 hours sleep to get to town, Minister Seymour. We're fast running out of time and available landfill space, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Minister, we must now drive forward with the implementation of Regen as a matter of urgency. Oh, or Mr. Speaker, may I dare suggest that we move the landfill out of Georgetown and away from the major highway and in plain sight of our arriving stayover tourists and from the balconies of our cruise tourists. We don't want to have another not in Bodden Town Bobo movement. Mr. Speaker, moving on to a bit about public transport. Mr. Speaker, I was personally encouraged when the minister responsible for transport, the member of Georgetown Central, told us just after taking office that his goal was to transform our approach to public transport. Mr. Speaker, I say that because for many, many years, public transport was such a small part of a large ministry that it did not get the attention that it deserved. And I was so warmed by the then minister, the minister responsible, by his enthusiasm. So, Mr. Speaker, you would expect then that the PAC government would make this issue a priority. However, despite there being considerable work on transforming public transport begun by the progressives that he could have picked up on, It was not until November 2022, over 18 months after taking office, Mr. Speaker, that the minister launched a consultancy study to design a solution. While we in the opposition were skeptical of the minister's approach, fearing, Mr. Speaker, that the study might have been designed simply to confirm preconceived ideas on a bus system. Now that the consultant's report is in the public domain, Mr. Speaker, we see our fears were confirmed. The study was too focused on buses and different options for their operation to be able to consider more radical options. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, we should not let the great be the enemy of the good. Rather than starting again, the government needs to tell us how the work to choose the best option for a new bus service will be taken forward and how that solution will be implemented, including, Mr. Speaker, its financing and a timetable for implementation. We must make progress on public transport, Mr. Speaker. Any further dithering on public transport would be bad news for commuters, bad news for those who need access to modern public transport, and bad news for our environment. Mr. Speaker, Cayman Bay just launched a hop-on, hop-off with a cute little electrical air-conditioned bus. Cricket Square has a hop-on, hop-off service for its tenants, even a shuttle into town. Once again, Mr. Speaker, we have the private sector leading the government. Quite frankly, as my honorable leader said, putting us to shame. Mr. Speaker, let me highlight something. That at $1 million per a mile to construct a new road, we have some $26.5 million budgeted over the next 2 years, versus, Mr. Speaker, $2 million for public transport over the same period. Then we can see where it would be worthwhile putting more immediate focus and resources on public transport. We cannot build ourselves out of this traffic issue. You could put $100 million in there. The only thing you will do is have more issues with the environmentalists and run out of space to build roads. Mr. Speaker, I'll take a few minutes to touch on the NICE program. The Leader of the Opposition reminded the Parliament of the motion that I brought before the House in September, which proposed supporting those who were finding it difficult to access work to get on a pathway of full-time employment. We can all agree, Mr. Speaker, that we have a litter issue. The teams that are at the DH are not enough. They can't keep up with the NRA cleaning or trimming of the roadsides, where we see the bush hogs cutting and chopping up the paper and the garbage and exasperating the situation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the Minister of Tourism. He left the room, and I say in the piece that took me so long to put in for him. I want to congratulate the Minister of Tourism on his Keep Cayman Clean campaign. I did tell him that personally. It's something that I thought about for a long time and championed and encouraged, and it never did get off the ground. Because I remember growing up, not only Keep Cayman Clean, but I worked for tourism campaign. Those two campaigns I remember on the radio and in the newspaper growing up, where you had persons from all over the community encouraging us to keep Cayman clean. And then we also had persons from across different sectors saying, I work for tourism. Never forget persons from then Cable and Wireless like Lara Cayasso saying, I work for tourism. Persons in the retail sector saying, I work for tourism. Those in the hotel saying, I work for tourism. Those at the airport, I work for tourism. So I must congratulate him on that campaign. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention the work and the ongoing work by the minister from Savannah, who is so passionate about keeping our islands clean. Mr. Speaker, my motion suggested an extended version of the successful National Community Enhancement Project in order to provide Caymanians with employment and with work experience. With the associated training programs also in place, This would considerably enhance the job prospects of hundreds of our Caymanians in long-term unemployment or experiencing other barriers to meaningful work, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Social Development responded positively to our ideas during the debate, and he has already put in place measures that will at least partially bring our ideas to fruition. In bringing forward the welfare reform package, Mr. Speaker, that the last progressive-led government initiated, the Minister announced recently that those outside the labour market and in receipt of NAU assistance would be supported to find what he described as internships. That would include some of the activities we had proposed in our motion, Mr. Speaker, such as beach cleaning, roadside painting, etc. But the Minister extended the approach into the private and not-for-profit sectors as well as public service. I do have concerns, Mr. Speaker, that when someone can't afford their utility bills or to put food on their table, whether or not they will go and volunteer at a non-for-profit or any other sector. I don't think that is the intention. But, Mr. Speaker, we welcome the Minister's initiative. If he can achieve our objectives by adapting our idea, then we certainly will not argue. In welcoming his plan, though, there are two things I would like to ensure that he incorporates, Mr. Speaker. First, although his plans focus on NAU recipients, I would like to see his proposed internships extended to others experiencing barriers to employment, such as former prison inmates. Secondly, the internship must be accompanied by structured training and development that incorporates not just on-the-job skills, but also meets the wider needs of participants to develop both basic skills in maths and English, and broader skills such as time and life management. Knowing the Minister and his drive to do things right, I believe he will be receptive to both of those points if he has not already incorporated those, Mr. Speaker. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to reiterate the Honourable Leader's plea that instead of 20 different things, we would urge the Premier to think about 7 key priorities this budget should focus on. 3 of those priorities are about tackling what we consider the most pressing challenges currently facing Cayman, and those are to overcome the ongoing impacts of the cost of living crisis, to reduce crime and the fear of crime, to enable better and more affordable access to housing, Mr. Speaker. The other 4 priorities are areas where action in the next 2 years covered by this budget is necessary to meet immediate challenges and better prepare Cayman for the future, Mr. Speaker. And those are to restore Cayman's economy to a path of steady, sustainable growth, and to accelerate action to mitigate climate change and to adapt it to its impacts, to resolve Grand Cayman's worsening traffic problems, and to respond positively to the challenges of an aging society. Mr. Speaker, I know that those on the other side are passionate about the plans proposed in this budget. But I urge them to be aware of the economic conditions and the obligations being placed on the shoulders of our people. Mr. Speaker, I would encourage them to consult with industry and hear their suggestions, ask how they can help transition new fees and taxes to avoid unintended consequences. Mr. Speaker, unintended consequences such as a decision to add 4% tax on bullion that resulted in the opposite result, where gold and silver left the country and importation of gold and silver hit a record low. Mr. Speaker, let's encourage them to first focus on the needs of our people today and in the future. But, Mr. Speaker, I guess we are the opposition and they are the government. And the difference perhaps could be described once by former US President Ronald Reagan when he said, "The difference between them and us is that we want to check government spending and they want to spend government checks." Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May God bless these Cayman Islands.
Thank you, Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable Member from Georgetown South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to deliver my contribution to the State Opening and Budget Address. Let me begin by reflecting positively on a couple of things that have been achieved by the Ministry of Education over the last 2 years.
Madam Member, could you adjust your mic? Thank you.
Of the John Gray High School main campus improvements. As you well know, Mr. Speaker, this was a project that I was involved in alongside the current Premier and Minister of Education during the last Progressives-led government. I was pleased and impressed with the new facilities at the high school when my colleagues and I had the chance to visit John Gray earlier this year. There is a significant price tag attached to the project, Mr. Speaker, with around 90 million having been spent. But that certainly seems to me justified on the basis that the new high school provides better facilities and a better learning environment that will be enjoyed not just by current students, but by future generations as well. I would like to put on record my congratulations to the current Premier and Minister of Education, the school staff, the ministry staff, and others who were involved in the successful delivery of the John Gray scheme. There are subsequent works to be completed, and the government's financial documents for the current period previously gave December 2023 as the completion date for both Project B, the refurbishment of the George Hicks site, and Project C, demolition of the SciFec campus and construction of new sports fields. Mr. Speaker, I note that the most recent set of quarterly unaudited accounts have slipped the date for completion of the final phase of the scheme by well over a year, to April 2025. It would be helpful to hear from the Premier and Minister why there is such a long delay. Of course, the major new initiative contained in the education budget introduced 2 years ago was the free school meals program in Cayman's public schools. One of the features of this year's spending by the PAC government is that the school meals budget has been underspending. Eventually, the projected underspend had to be taken in order to help to offset massive overspends elsewhere in the ministry's budget, notably for scholarships and bursaries. I accept, Mr. Speaker, that the amount budgeted for the free school meals program was only ever a rough estimate. It was hard to know the cost prior to implementation, given that the government had not prepared a properly costed implementation plan prior to announcing the initiative. I expect we will see a more realistic budget for 2024 and thereafter set out in the budget papers. But either now or in Finance Committee, I would like the Premier and Minister to explain the reasons behind the underspending on free school meals. As far as I can see, there could be three possible explanations for the underspend. Presumably, the budget was worked out by creating an estimated amount per meal for each type of meal, and then multiplying it by the expected take-up. Leaving aside some ministry overhead, those two things will therefore be the drivers of spending. For there to be an underspend, either the cost per meal is lower than estimated, or the take-up is lower than expected. If the first of those is the case, I want the Premier and Minister to reassure the House that costs per meal have not been reduced by cutting corners on quality. In particular, I want reassurance that appropriate nutritional standards are still in place and are still being met. I want to know that suppliers are being inspected to ensure hygiene and other requirements are also being met. If it is the case that take-up is lower than expected, does the ministry understand why that has happened? In particular, is lower take-up compromising the efficacy of the program? The third possible cause is that the annual budget was correct, but the delays in the rollout of the program have caused a one-off underspend. If that were the case, I would still like the Premier and Minister's reassurances on nutritional standards and the other matters I referred to just now. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, I still want to hear the Premier and Minister's view of the efficacy of the program. As the Leader of the Opposition has pointed out on more than one occasion, the lack of a coherent response to the cost of living crisis has led the government to try repeatedly to rebadge the free school meals program as an initiative designed to help hard-pressed families with their monthly bills. This is simply not true. For one thing, were the program in place to tackle the cost of living crisis, as the impact of that crisis lessens, as we all hope it will, in the months ahead, will the government be ending the program? I very much doubt that will be the case. The reason for that is that this was never designed as a cost of living measure. Let me recall the former Premier's heartwarming justification for the policy when it was first presented to Parliament in his first strategic policy statement speech on the 14th of July 2021. The former Premier told us, and I quote, "Study after study has shown that hungry children are poor students. They have poor cognition and educational performance. They are more likely to repeat a grade, come to school late, or miss school altogether. We know for a fact we have children who come to our public schools who have missed meals. I have spent time with PTAs and the incredible parents who have all spent time to try to address these issues. I see the concern on their faces, and I share the need with them to have this issue addressed. Mr. Speaker, this PAC government has as one of its goals to continue to improve education, beginning with a basic step to ensure that all of our students are fed, giving them the foundation to earn a great education," unquote. So, Mr. Speaker, this was always intended as an educational initiative. And now that we are well into its implementation, we should be able to judge its success. The former Premier referenced the many studies on this topic as justification for the free school meals program. Presumably, the ministry therefore used those studies to define the success criteria for the program. The former Premier mentioned a few such goals, and there are others. Presumably also, the ministry has been hard at work monitoring the impact the program is having against the success criteria it defined. So, can the Premier and Minister tell the House the results of the monitoring and evaluation that her ministry has been doing? Is the free school meals program achieving the educational goals that were set for it. One more thing before I move on, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned just now that the underspend on school meals this year went to prop up the scholarships and bursaries budget, which was incurring expenditure at nearly double the expected rate. It would also be useful to hear from the Premier and Minister whether she expects that level of expenditure on scholarships and bursaries to continue, and whether that is reflected in the new budget figures before us. The completion of the John Gray campus and the Free School Meals initiative are perhaps the most obvious things that have happened in the last 2 years, Mrs. Speaker. And as I have said, both should help improve learning in our public schools system. But big projects such as those two should not blind us, Mrs. Speaker, to the problem of lack of pace and lack of urgency in driving up educational standards that has characterized the PAC government's approach. I have said many times before that I am broadly supportive of the current Premier and Minister's policy direction. It is, of course, a continuation of the policy we were working towards together in the last Progressives-led government. But I have also said repeatedly that I would be holding the Premier and Minister to account for the progress that she's making in implementing that policy direction and making improvements that will benefit our students. Mr. Speaker, her report card currently reads, "Could do better and must try harder." One of my concerns about the shake-up on the benches opposite is that it leaves the new Premier with a mammoth job to do. Not only is she Premier, a hard enough role itself, even in the best of circumstances, and as we have seen, these are not the best of circumstances. She's also Minister of Finance and Economic Development at a time when getting this budget together has been so problematic, and when, as the Leader of the Opposition has highlighted, the country faces significant economic and fiscal challenges. And she's Minister for Lands, and she's Minister for District Administration, and she has ministerial oversight of the Cabinet Office. And finally, she is Minister of Education. While her colossal capacity for hard work is well known, this seems way too much. The Education Ministry should not be a part-time job. It requires full attention and relentless focus. It will be very difficult for the Premier and Minister to try harder when her attention is taken up by so many other responsibilities. As a result, it will be very difficult for her to do better. But try harder and do better she must if she is to get Cayman's public schools on to the improvement trajectory that is necessary. The evidence that the trajectory of improvement from the very latest inspection reports published by the Office of Education Standards presents what it is, at best, a mixed picture. While most public schools are maintaining their position in terms of the overall inspection judgments given, we are not seeing public schools improve their rating in the way we should be expecting. Let me just illustrate this issue by focusing on our 3 high schools. The second inspection cycle reports on John Gray High School and Lehman E. Scott Senior High School awarded both schools an improved rating of good. Clifton Hunter High School also took a major step forwards, improving its rating to satisfactory in the second cycle. In all 3 high schools, therefore, the focus on raising standards of the last Progressives-led government led to demonstrable improvement in each school's performance. The third inspection cycle reports have just been published, Mr. Speaker. Each high school has maintained its rating from the second cycle. Under the PAC government, no high school has improved its overall rating. But if we dig down into the inspection reports, we see a more mixed and nuanced picture. The detailed judgments given to our 3 high schools suggest that Layman Scott is continuing to improve towards an excellent judgment. John Gray has broadly maintained its position, and Clifton Hunter has, if anything, slipped backwards. The inspection judgments are an important benchmark of our school's performance. And the evidence is that we need to see much more improvement before we can be in any way satisfied. But school improvement is most important, not in its own right, but in helping us to gauge the ability of our schools to support our students to achieve. It is the metric of levels of attainment by students that needs to drive our policy and our budget decisions. The key issue that I raised from the very beginning of this administration was the need to maintain our focus on raising standards and levels of attainment. And in order to do that, to continue to make improvements in the quality of teaching and learning. In my view, the necessary focus has been lacking, and we have lost the momentum of improvement that had begun under the progressives. Let me focus on just one more issue to illustrate my point, Mr. Speaker. It is an issue close to my heart, which the Leader of the Opposition referred to earlier in this debate, and that is levels of achievement in mathematics. When the Minister of Education released its data report covering the 2020-2021 academic year, I immediately highlighted the need to focus on improving mathematics results. I made statements, I wrote press articles, I pressed the Premier and Minister to take action to tackle what was clearly a deficit that needed to be addressed. Despite my public campaign, very little happened. When the Minister released its data report for 2021-22, it revealed that rather than improving, the situation had gotten worse. The number of Year 11 students achieving Level 2 in mathematics had in fact fallen from 43% in 2021 to 40% in 2022. As I have repeatedly warned, this low attainment rate in mathematics is holding back the level of achievement of the national standard of 5 Level 2 subjects, including English and mathematics. Clearly, though, despite my warnings, the issue was not being addressed. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that had changed was the Ministry's acknowledgement that I was correct. This year, the Ministry's report confirmed my analysis by concluding that success in raising the number of students achieving the national standard is tied to the ability of schools to raise achievement standards in mathematics. It had taken the Ministry a year just to acknowledge the problem, a year in which that problem could have been tackled, a year in which instead more Caymanian students suffered from the consequences of the failure to act. So having identified the problem and correctly identified its significance, one might have expected immediate action to be taken. Positively, the Minister identified the need to introduce specialist mathematics teachers to drive up the quality of teaching of the subject. But we then learned that there was apparently no money to pay those specialist teachers, so the initiative could not be progressed until Finance Committee voted additional monies to the Ministry at the September meeting. I hope the new teachers are now all in post in our schools and operating effectively. The problem is that they were not put in place until 18 months after I started raising the issue. And it should not have needed me to raise the issue, Mr. Speaker. The problem was obvious from the data, as this year's report noted. So why was it not picked up in the 2021 data report and acted upon immediately? I must also ask what else is being done to focus on improving mathematics results in our public schools. I welcome the introduction of specialist teachers, It is something I have previously advocated, but that alone is not sufficient. The introduction of the new national curriculum by the last Progressives-led government is an important step. It provides the coherent, focused, and demanding mathematics curriculum the country needs, reflecting the logical and sequential nature of mathematics. We now need to ensure that all the teaching of mathematics is closely aligned to the curriculum and that all lessons achieved at least a good rating from inspectors. Beyond that, I have consistently argued that we need to see differentiated classroom instruction with immediate intervention for students who are not mastering mathematics standards to give students the individual instruction they need to succeed. In short, Mr. Speaker, we need a focused strategy for improving mathematics. But improving standards in mathematics, while the most important thing is not the only thing we need to be doing. As I have said repeatedly, improving the quality of teaching across the board is the most important contributor to raising standards in education. That starts with being able to attract the best and brightest of our young Caymanian talent into the teaching profession. I therefore welcome the increases in funding available as education teaching scholarships to those wishing to pursue teaching qualifications when that funding was announced 2 years ago. Again, we should now be able to judge the success of that program. Can the Premier and Minister tell us what impact the increased funding has had over the last 2 years? After recruitment, continuing professional development is essential. This needs to take the form not just of formal courses and training programs, but most importantly, it needs to focus on in-classroom support to improve teaching practice. And, Mr. Speaker, we know that the quality of teaching must improve. The Office of Education Standards published last January a comprehensive report summarizing its view on the progress that had been made in Cayman schools over its first 2 full inspection cycles between 2018 and 2022. On the positive side, the Office of Education Standards reported significant improvement in the quality of teaching in Cayman's secondary schools. However, inspectors also found that teaching quality has remained stagnant in primary schools, and that this presents a significant barrier to raising education standards. That report was published nearly a year ago. What action has the Premier and Minister taken in that time to drive up the quality of teaching in primary schools? And when will the necessary improvements be seen in Cayman's public school classrooms? It is clear that further improvements in teaching will be necessary. The OES found that there are no judgments of excellent teaching in core subjects in government schools across both inspection cycles. We cannot be satisfied with that situation, Mr. Speaker. So can the Premier and Minister tell us what targets has been set for improvement in teaching for the next 2 years? And can she assure us that there are sufficient resources in this budget before us to ensure that the quality of teaching by all teachers, and I repeat that, by all teachers in Cayman's public schools will improve over the next 2 years? The focus in everything we do in education needs to be on raising standards in our schools so that we can better support our students to achieve and to realize their potential. Mr. Speaker, I note that the Minister of Education has recently congratulated government schools on the examination results they achieved this summer. The Minister points to what it describes as the steady upward trend in exam performance in our schools. Of course, we have not yet seen the data on which the Ministry is basing its message. I look forward to seeing the annual data report when it is published, presumably early in the new year. For now, Mr. Speaker, I will make just 2 points. First, we need to make sure that any general trend of improvement is apparent across the board, at all levels and in all subjects. As I have illustrated, previous reports have reported an overall trend of improvement that masks underperformance in mathematics. I therefore hope that the Ministry's analysis goes beyond the general trend, identifies areas where improvement is necessary, and proposes action to target those areas of weakness. That is what will make the biggest difference, Mr. Speaker. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, I will be very interested at the rate of improvement in results. Is a steady upward trend identified good enough? In mathematics, we know that steady improvement is not sufficient. Cayman is lagging way behind international competitor jurisdictions, and that will necessitate a step change in our results, not just a steady improvement. In short, Mr. Speaker, I hope the Ministry's message of congratulations to our schools is not a sign of complacency. We all know that much more needs to be done if we are to take Cayman's public schools to the position we all wish them to be in. The Ministry must be relentlessly focused on the action needed to drive improvement. In that context, the last issue that I want to raise today, Mr. Speaker, was also something raised by the Office of Education Standards in the report I just mentioned. It is the issue of school governance. The Office of Education Standards report concluded that the lack of effective school governance is impeding progress in Cayman's public schools. They went as far as to say that there is a necessity to swiftly progress plans to improve governance structures in the education sector to strengthen engagement and promote accountability. Mr. Speaker, has that call for swift progress been heeded? Following the publication of the report in January, I asked the Premier and Minister about her plans for governance reform at the parliamentary session in April. Towards the end of May, I received a written response which I will read to the House. The Premier and Minister replied, and I quote, "I have recently led a delegation to the UK to visit high-performing schools and had the opportunity to gain valuable information on school governance models. The Ministry team and Education Council will now take this work forward as we craft a model which will be advantageous to the unique Cayman Island context," unquote. This response was hugely disappointing, Mr. Speaker. That it took nearly a month to produce such a bland couple of sentences suggests that the governance issue was not being acted upon with any great urgency, despite the OES's criticisms. More importantly, not only does the reply kick the can down the road, it kicks the can down a road we have already traveled. The Premier and Minister led a similar delegation to the UK during the last Progressives-led administration. She said then she'd gained valuable information. She asked the Education Council then to define a bespoke scheme to suit Cayman's circumstances. As a result, concrete proposals for improved governance arrangements were recommended to her by Education Council during the last Progressives-led administration. Plans were in place to pilot the new arrangements in 2 primary schools, but were delayed prior to the last election, first by the implementation of the new national curriculum, and then by the COVID pandemic. Why has no progress been made during the PAC term of office? Why has the work begun all over again? Nothing has changed in the UK. That means different lessons will be learned from last time. Nothing has changed in Cayman's context. That means the previously recommended model needs wholesale revision. It's long past the time to get on and deliver a new governance model for our public schools, Mr. Speaker. After 2 years of totally unnecessary delay, will the Premier and Minister now commit to making the swift progress that both her own Office of Education Standards and we in the opposition believe is necessary to implement new governance arrangements for Cayman's public schools? Will she tell Parliament today what she plans to do and by when? Will she guarantee that any necessary resources to support the transition to and the operation of a new governance model are in the budget before us? Mr. Speaker, there is a clear pattern here. Leave aside that the opposition's calls for improvement are going unheeded. We might expect that. But the government is failing even to listen to itself. The need for progress on improving mathematics teaching is clear in the ministry's own data, but it takes over 18 months before action begins to be taken. The OES observes that the lack of necessary governance changes is holding back school improvement, and far from the swift progress recommended, we get more provocation and delay. The real problem with Cayman's education system is the lack of urgency in implementing the changes that government itself knows are necessary. And that failure is having a real impact on our Cayman's students right now. It must change, Mr. Speaker. This budget is an opportunity to ensure that the considerable resources available for education are properly targeted on the things that will have the biggest impact and make the biggest difference. The Premier and Minister must reassure me and the country that the budget she is presenting to Parliament takes that opportunity. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on a brighter note, I would like to turn to my Christmas message. Christmas is a special time of year because family and community feature at the very heart of our festive celebrations. As we go about buying gifts, decorating, and preparing the delicious meals we all look forward to, I know we will also find ways to give wholeheartedly to others in need, for that is our custom, especially at this time of the year. I particularly hope that we will reach out to our seniors in our constituencies, as well to the sick and those who have lost loved ones over this past year, and many of us have. Pay them a visit or take them a meal. I would like to take this opportunity to wish my family, my constituents of Georgetown South, and the wider community, all of my colleagues here in the opposition and also in the government, and the Parliament staff, a very Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy, safe, and blessed New Year. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member from Georgetown South. We will now take the luncheon adjournment suspension. We will resume at 2:30.